morning, it's Michelle from Buttercup Jewellery. Today I'm going to touch a little bit about metal clay. I've been asked by Kernowcraft to make a little tutorial about how I make some of my metal clay and enamel jewellery. So I'm going to be doing some little video clips of that and some photos that you'll be able to follow in a straightforward tutorial. So I thought I'd just start off by going through a little bit of the equipment and materials that you need to get started in metal clay. It's a really amazing way of making jewellery. It's really straightforward. It's not expensive in terms of buying equipment to get you started. So I'm just going to show you some of the things that I use and I'll be using. So obviously you need some metal clay, and it comes in lots of different sized packs. I have just always used art clay, but there's PMC. I use silver, but you can get all sorts of different base metals, copper, bronze. You can get gold as well, and paint on top of the silver with some gold. It can come in forms like I'll be showing you when I do my example. It looks a lot like normal clay, sort of plasticine kind of texture. Or you can get it in syringe form. So you can then syringe on little bits of detail or make your more elaborate designs. And then it can also come in a form that you can paint on. I haven't explored that one yet, but that will no doubt be a plan for the future. And then in terms of equipment to actually make your pieces, I've got a little Perspex plastic board that I use because it's non-stick, so that allows you to roll the material out and not worry too much about it sticking to anything. And I just use a little plastic roller. You can buy these, or you can just make them from pieces of tube, or if you do fondant icing and things like that, then they're the same sorts of ones that you would use for that. So they're easy to buy. Also, you can make freehand designs, but you can also use fondant cutters to make your designs. So for my little flowers, I'm going to be using the slightly larger cutter. This one makes a small one that I use when I'm putting like forget-me-not rings and things together. But the thing to remember with metal clay, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, when you fire it, it becomes a little bit smaller, 10% smaller, so you need to just take that into account. You'll also need some way of getting your metal clay at a level height across the piece. So you'll hear metal clay workers talk a lot about using playing cards, because then you can get a consistency across the height, but you can also buy little plastic strips that you can layer up. But to be honest, a cheap pack of playing cards is absolutely fine and adequate. I also have a little water bottle, so I can just keep the piece moist, because the more you handle the metal clay, the drier it becomes and it will start to crack, and you don't obviously want cracking in your pieces. So just have a little water bottle handy. And then if you're using your roller or your board or on your cards, I just have a little pot with some olive oil in, so I can just put a little tiny bit of that onto any tools I'm using, so again it doesn't stick. And then you might also just have a little paintbrush around, so that if you need to move the metal clay, you can do that in a gentle way without damaging it. I also have pack of wet wipes, because you never know, but also because when you've got any little bits of leftover metal clay, it's silver, so you don't want it to go to waste, you don't want it to dry out, so you put it back into packaging, and I'll show you what it comes like in the next little video when you take it out of the packaging. But I put it back in. I sometimes then wrap that in a wet wipe just to make sure there's some moisture with it, and I pop it into a box just to keep it moist and usable for another session. You can also buy little cutters that you can use. Here comes my dog. That will obviously give you different shapes. So if you've got a particular design in mind, just have a look online. There are absolutely tons of different shapes you can buy, and textures that you can buy as well, to give you a different effect on the front of your clay. But again, you don't have to spend a small fortune. Pieces of wallpaper, bits of leather, any materials you find around the house, things like the net oranges come in, that orangey greeny net that you can have around oranges, that gives a lovely texture. So all sorts of, anything, leaves, you can make beautiful textures in your metal clay without spending a small fortune on textures. So that's a little start off video, and then I'll just show you the next process when you actually start getting going with making your piece. Okay, so when you open up your packet of metal clay, I've got a 50-gram one here because I just buy it in bulk, but you can get smaller packs. It's like 7 grams, 20 grams, 10 grams. So in my big pack of 50, I've got this little pack of 5, which was a freebie. So it comes all sealed up inside, and you've got these little tabs, so you just rip it open and you can then see that's your little tiny piece of metal clay. So this is 5 grams of metal clay, and it's wrapped in a plastic covering. So what I do is I'll unwrap that, but I'll keep this plastic safe nearby, and then when I've actually got the leftover pieces, I'll then roll them back into a ball, put them back in here, and then pop them back inside the packet and seal it, so that, as I said earlier on, it keeps it so it stays moist. Okay, so that's what you'll get, and now I'm going to just do a little bit of filming of me rolling the clay. So I'm going to now roll out my clay. So I've popped my little ball of clay in between 2 stacks of cards. There are 6 cards in each stack, so when I roll the clay, it's going to be 6 cards thick. I've popped a little bit of olive oil just on my baseboard and a tiny weeny bit onto my roller. So I'm just going to push down, roll forwards, roll backwards. Take a card off each pile, turn the clay, roll again. So my clay is now 5 cards thick. Now what I'm going to do is just pop a card on the bottom, just because this makes it easier when I'm cutting and drying. And now I'm going to just roll one more time, so it's now 4 cards thick. So that's ready to be cut out. Okay, so I'm now going to use my cutter to cut out a couple of flowers from my metal clay. So it's just press down. I'm not going to use the little dibber, but you can see we've got one there. So just pop that out, and then I might be able to just get another one from that piece. There we go. And then this is my leftover. So as I said before, I'll just pop that back into the plastic to keep it sealed up safe inside my packet. Oops, don't want that to roll over it. Okay, so that's our little flowers ready. Okay, the final thing I'm going to do before I let the clay dry is I'm just going to pop a little hole for a jump ring to go through in the top of each flower. So I'm going to use a special spiky tool called a clay pick, but a cocktail stick or something like that would be equally fine. So you don't want it right on the very edge, in a little bit, and again be aware that there will be some shrinkage. So even though it may look like it's big enough for a jump ring to go through, often after it's been fired, it isn't. So just make sure you've given yourself a little bit of room for the jump ring to fit. So that's that little bit done. Okay, so once you've made the metal clay designs, what you need to do is let them dry. Now that can be best done overnight, so I tend to make my pieces and just leave them to dry out in the house overnight. Or because I use a kiln to fire my pieces, I'll pop pieces on top of the warm kiln, and then they dry quite quickly. Or you can get little cup warmers that you can plug in and just pop them on there. You need to be absolutely sure they're dry before you fire them, because otherwise they could explode, which obviously after you've gone to the trouble of making them, you don't want them all to be blowing up, and obviously you don't want to be doing that if you're torch firing. So a little test you can do is to just put your piece of metal clay onto a reflective surface like a little mirror, and then if it leaves any condensation on there, you know it's still got moisture inside and it's not dry enough yet, so leave it for a little bit longer. But then once your piece is definitely dry, you can fire it. So metal clay is, as it sounds, clay with metal inside, so it's silver particles that have been put within the clay, and the clay acts as a binder. When you heat that up, the binder burns off, and then you're left with the silver, all the molecules of silver joined together to make a piece of silver. 99% pure, so even purer than sterling silver. So it's brilliant stuff, and it's brilliant for enamelling because it doesn't react with the enamels in the same way that sterling silver does. So you get a real clarity if you're using enamels with it. So if you're going to be wanting to do metal clay, you probably aren't going to want to invest in a kiln straight away. So there is an alternative, firing your clay pieces with a blowtorch. I use a kiln, I don't use a blowtorch, but it's really straightforward to do. So you'll need a brick to put your piece onto that's fireproof, and these can all be bought from Kernowcraft. You'll need a small burner. So again, these are reasonably cheap to buy, and you'll also need some butane gas to pop inside here, otherwise it won't light. And then it's really straightforward, so you just turn, and then you'll see you've got your flame. And so what you do is you pop your clay pieces onto your brick. You make sure you're in a nice safe place, and then you will heat up the clay. So you want to have your burner about 5 centimetres away from the surface of the clay, and then you heat it quite gently, and you'll see it start to change. So initially the burner, the binder will burn off, so you'll have a little bit of smoke, maybe a bit of fire. Don't panic, it will stop burning and there'll be flames will go out, so it's all okay. To use your torch, you need to be using fairly small pieces of metal clay, so no bigger than 25 grams, or a £2 coin kind of size, because it just takes too much effort for the torch to be able to heat up the clay to a sufficient level for it to go to silver if it's too big. So that would be something that would have to go into the kiln. So you heat it and you watch for a colour change. So when the clay gets to a peachy colour, then you will sustain your contact with the clay and start timing. So then you time so that you will keep heating it and try and keep that peachy colour for 2 minutes. Can be a little bit more if you've got a larger piece of clay, but normally 2 minutes is about right. If your clay starts to go red, it's getting to the point where it might melt. So you need to just move the torch away a little bit to allow the temperature to just drop back down again, and you'll see the colour change, go back down to that peachy colour, and then you can carry on going round with your torch. And then when your 2 minutes is up, you can stop, and the clay will then be silver. Okay, so I'm going to fire mine in the kiln, so they're just drying at the moment, and then I'll pop them in and then I'll show you what they look like when they're finished. Okay, so once your pieces have dried, what you'll need to do then before firing is to just clean them up a little bit. So I've got these small little 3M polishing pads that you can buy. They can also be bought in larger sheets as well, so I'll give you the details for those. So the clay is obviously very delicate, so you want to just go very gently and just tidy up any edges, perhaps where a little bit of the clay was textured by your cutter. You don't want that finish, you want it smooth, so you just go around the edge and just get off any little excess pieces. The reason why I've still got the playing card and my little board underneath is just because obviously there is silver in these particles. So we want to capture everything that we can, and I have a little pot, a bit like my normal silver scrap pot, and I just collect everything up, and then you can reconstitute that, wet it, reconstitute it, make it back into clay again. So that's the other lovely thing about metal clay, is it is all recyclable, and even when you have finished a piece and you fired it, if you don't like it, you can go in your scrap pot to be melted back into fine silver. So it's all recycled, so the actual particles of silver that are within the metal clay are recycled. So it's brilliant from that point of view, that it's not doing any harm to the environment. The other thing to just do a double check on is your hole for your jump ring. So I've just got a little piece of wire, so I'm just going to pop that through from both sides. Sometimes it can look perfect from the front, but then at the back it sort of closes back in on itself when you use the hole making device. So this will just make sure that after it's fired you'll be able to pop that jump ring through without any difficulties, because there's nothing worse, and I have been there. In fact, I've got to the very end of enamelling only to discover that actually I can't get a jump ring through. So lesson learned is check as you go, make it bigger at the very earliest stage to save yourself a lot of heartache and stress later on. And just give them a little bit of a tidy up on the back. Okay, and they'll be good to go in my kiln, or if you're using a torch they'll be good to be fired. So if you do happen to have a kiln, maybe you work in glass, or you maybe do other sorts of enamelling and you just fancy having a go at silver clay, if you want to fire your clay in the kiln, I use 900 degrees for my temperature, and I fire it in there for 2 hours. Some people do less time, and if you've just got a little flat piece, so you know these earrings, you can actually do a shorter schedule, so you know maybe only 15-20 minutes. But what I find is I'm often firing larger pieces, or pieces that I need to shape, so maybe rings, in which case I really need it to be fired kind of to the max, so it's got that really good bonding between the particles of silver, so that it's really robust and flexible, so I can hammer it and it doesn't crack. So 900 degrees for a couple of hours is where these little pieces are going to be going in a minute. So once you've finished firing, your metal clay will have changed into a sort of pearlescent white finish, and that is now pure silver. So everything has burnt off, all the binder is burnt away, and so we're just left with the silver. And before we want to enamel that, we want it polished, because once you've put the enamel on, you won't be wanting to do anything too aggressive to the piece, because obviously the enamel is glass and so it could easily be bashed off, so we don't want that. So you can polish your clay using a brass brush under some water, a little bit of washing up liquid, give it a scrub, and the silver would start to reveal. Or you can be really lazy like me and use a barrel polisher. So I pop all my pieces in after they've cooled into here with some water, some barrel bright, and you can hear there is some stainless steel shot in there, so little balls, little spikes, and some that look a little bit like little flying saucers. And then you pop the lid on and you put it onto your little tumbling machine, and 10 minutes or so will be enough to get the silver to come through. And then all you need to do before enamelling is then make sure those pieces are clean. Even though they've been in with the barrel bright, you want to just make sure that they are completely sparkly clean. So it's worth just giving a little bit of a rub over with some washing up liquid under the tap, and just make sure that the water is running off. So that means there's no grease or anything, any contaminants on the surface that could affect the adherence of the enamel onto the silver. But because it's almost pure silver, 99%, it works really, really well with enamels. It's a little bit porous, so some of the enamel will be absorbed, but in a way that helps with the stickability of it. So I find it works really, really nicely. So I'll come back on in a little while and show you the enamelling stage. Okay, so my little silver pieces have come out of my barrel polisher, so they're all nice and shiny. Another way to polish them, so once you have given them a good scrub with your brush, basically if you rub anything metal onto them, you will start to get a shine. So you can use the back of a spoon to burnish, or you can use an actual burnisher that you can purchase. So these might be metal, or you can have agate burnishers as well. So I'll put some links in for those, but just a little teaspoon, rub it with the back of the teaspoon and you'll start to get a shine. Okay, so we're now going to start to have a little think about the enamelling process. I'm going to use some opaque enamels for this. So I'm going to do a base coat on them, and then I'm going to use some different colours so that we've got a nice little selection. So maybe a bit of pale pink, some blues, some reds, some yellows. The world's your oyster when it comes to enamels. There's a whole heap of different colours that you can choose from. So because it's going to be an opaque enamel, we won't be able to see the silver through. You could use transparent enamels. As I say, they work really nicely with metal clay because they don't react with it in the same way that they do with sterling, so there's a bit less preparation that you need to do, and you can then see a little bit of shimmer through. But it's quite nice if you are going to use transparent enamels to use a bit of texture, so maybe that will be something for another video another day. Okay, so I'm now going to just sieve over the enamel. So I've put some enamel powder here in the bottom of my sieve, and I'm now just going to gently apply a little layer over each of my flowers. And you can see I'm not tapping the sieve, I'm just scraping my fingernail down it just to get a little fine dusting. So that is the first coat applied. So what we'll now move on to doing is heating these to melt the enamel. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to torch fire our earrings with that first coat of enamel. So what I've done is I've just set up a tripod with a layer of non-burning material underneath. I'm just going to have a little bit of a tidy up because I've got quite a lot of plastic lying around from earlier on, so it's a little bit safer for us to work on. And I'm going to use my little torch that I showed you earlier on, and when we're torch firing enamel, we fire from underneath because otherwise you will contaminate the colour. So we just turn the torch on and then we just start firing gently from underneath, and you'll see the enamel powder start to change. So it goes through a range of different textures. So you can practice this a little bit. It might be an idea, if you've never enamelled before, to practice on copper first of all, because obviously it's less valuable, and then you can just see how the enamel works and you can try out different colours. The colours will come out a little bit differently if you're working with transparent enamels, but with opaques you'll get the same effect. So you can see the colour has changed, it's gone a kind of beige colour now, and that's fine. That's what we would expect. The process is obviously a lot slower torch firing than it is when you pop something in the kiln, because the kiln gets up to heat very, very quickly and it retains that heat. So now we're going through the first sort of textural change where the enamel sort of seems to start to clump up a little bit, like if you're melting sugar you get that kind of frosted effect. And then we're now going smoother, so we'll just keep going, and it will then slowly just smooth over completely. And it's quite good doing this in natural light, because you can also see any changes in the silver as well, because what you don't want is the silver to get too hot and melt. So you can see there now that we've got a smooth, shiny finish to our piece. So I'll just stop the video there. I'll do the other one, and I'll also do some in the kiln as well, and then we'll put the next layer of enamel on. Okay, so the next stage is going to be putting on our coloured enamel layer over the top. So you can see we've got our base coat on there, and so now I'm going to just use this teal enamel. I've switched to a smaller sieve. It doesn't make any difference, it's just a little bit easier to manage, and also the hole size on the mesh is a little bit smaller too, so I'm actually going to be getting a finer grain coming through my sieve on this bit, so it should get a nice smooth finish. Something I didn't mention before is I'm sieving onto a page out of a magazine. Just happens it's a nice flowery one, so it's a little bit distracting, but it's got a nice sheen to it, and when I've finished the sieving I then transfer the leftover excess enamel back into my enamel bag, so I'm not wasting any, and it comes off these magazine pages really easily, whereas if it's just normal paper it sticks to that a little bit. The other thing to say is I would normally be wearing a mask when I'm doing the sieving, because the enamel has got glass powder in it, and obviously we don't want to be inhaling huge amounts of that. I use unleaded enamel, so there isn't a poisoning risk or anything like that, but obviously glass particles are not great for your lungs, so I'd invest in a mask as well when you're enamelling. I'm not doing it today because you won't be able to necessarily hear what I'm saying. So here we go with coat number 2. So this is a nice teal colour. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to transfer these onto my little mesh so that I can pop them into the kiln. The kiln does exactly the same as firing with the torch, but it just it allows you to do quantities quite quickly, so I can get several pairs done. The other thing to just double check before you fire is that your hole for your jump ring hasn't been filled with enamel, because obviously that is also going to prevent you being able to push your jump ring through. Okay, so I'll pop these in the kiln and then we'll have a little look at them afterwards. Okay, so here we are ready for our final Kernowcraft video, and you'll see here that I have made some more of the little flowers in different colours. So we've got the teal ones that I showed you, and then I've also made some in poppy red and in yellow enamel, and then I thought I'd also just demonstrate that you can make these into pendants as well. So I've just literally popped a jump ring through and added a 45cm sterling silver trace chain onto that as well. So what I'm just going to talk through is adding on your jump rings and then popping on an earring wire. And you'll see here I've got a whole range of earring wires from my collection, really simple, through to these ones which I love. These are my favourites with a little bobble on, and then we've got these ones where you've got the hook and the little ball and the spring. So these ones are sterling silver, but you can use other ones that are surgical stainless steel. Those are fine. I just prefer to use sterling silver for my pieces. And then we've got a range of jump rings as well. I'm going to use this large one to just demonstrate opening and closing for you. I wouldn't use one this large. This is an 8mm jump ring. So I tend to use these ones which are 4mm or these ones which are 3mm, and then you've got a 5mm one there as well. Essentially all you need to do with your jump ring is to open it up a little bit wider so that you can hook it on. So I use a pair of pliers for this. So we literally just open it up a little bit and then we pop on our charm, and then what we do is just push it back past itself a little bit, and then it generally will spring close. Sometimes these larger ones are a little bit too springy. Okay, and then it's a little bit higher on one side, so I'm just going to press down with my pliers to close it up. So on these sorts of earrings where they're quite lightweight, that will be absolutely fine to just close it like that. If you're using jump rings on a heavier piece, you might need to solder it closed. So you can get solder paste. I use easy solder paste because that means it's got quite a low melting point, so it will flow and close that ring up beautifully for you without melting the actual jump ring itself. So that will work really nicely if you're wanting to close a jump ring permanently. Okay, so on these I've just popped a couple of jump rings on. You could literally pop the charm straight onto the ear wire, but I find that then is a little bit static, and I quite like them to have a little bit of wobble. So I pop a couple of jump rings on, then attach that onto the ear wire, and job done. So hopefully that's given you some ideas to make yourself a little collection of flower earrings. You could combine enamel colours as well. So you could do a first coat in one colour and then maybe just pop a little bit of another colour maybe into the middle to give yourself more of a sort of daisy effect. Or it might be that you use a bit of an opaque first layer and then use some transparent enamel over the top of that, which will allow some of the opaque colour to come through. So lots of different options. Enamelling can be a bit of a temperamental thing. I think I say in one of the other videos or in the lesson notes, you might want to just start off having a dabble with copper. You can get little copper pieces to have a try out on first. Same principles apply. It has to be clean before you apply the enamel powder, but obviously then if something goes wrong, it's not as expensive as if something goes wrong on silver. So that might be something to try, but it's absolutely fab. I love enamelling. I love the effects that you can get. The other thing I'd say is if things do go wrong, there are a couple of obvious causes usually. So the first one would be that your piece is a little bit contaminated, so at some point maybe you've touched it and just the natural grease on our fingers will be enough in some cases for that enamel not to adhere properly, and it might not reveal itself until you're on your second coat and then all of a sudden it starts peeling away. The other reason can sometimes be a temperature shock. So last winter I didn't sort of think about it. In the morning I popped the kiln on, did some enamelling, took the enamel out and popped it straight onto my tile surface that I used to cool down, not thinking that tile surface was probably around -3 in temperature, and so the shock of going from 800 degrees down to -3 was enough for it to ping the enamel off. You know, little things to be aware of, but generally it all goes smoothly and you have beautiful results. So I really hope that that's been helpful and enjoyable for you, and good luck with your enamelling and metal clay projects in the future. So this is Michelle from Buttercup Jewellery signing off. Thank you.